Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to look at two separate caves that together are responsible for dozens of terrifying deaths between them. These are some of those horrifying incidents, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Sink. On the night of May 11th, 1990, 8 members of the Florida Speleological Researchers, or FSR, readied themselves for a dive at the Sand Hill Boy Scout Camp in Brooksville, Florida. Formed in the late 1980s, the FSR is a group of cave divers who spend their time mapping uncharted caves. And among the team on that night was 25-year-old Lloyd. The cave they were going to be exploring is known as a place for only the most advanced cave divers, called Deep Boulder Sink #2. And Lloyd, for one, was particularly excited. Pretty much every dive gave him that feeling, as he was known to be enthusiastic about his relatively newfound hobby. But his eagerness had already earned him a bit of a reputation. The Sand Hill Boy Scout Camp lies almost directly in the middle of the town of Brooksville and Weeki Wachee Springs in Hernando County, Florida. When the last member of the Dipolder family died in the 1970s, the land that was once private property was given over to the Boy Scouts. Since then, the property's aqua blue pond has been of particular interest to some of cave diving's biggest names. Known as the Deepholder Sink, the system is actually made up of two separate areas, Deepholder Sink number 2 and Deepholder Sink number 3. But it's #2 that has captured the attention of cave divers from all over the world. With a maximum depth of 360 feet, or about 110 meters, it's the deepest known underwater cave in the continental U.S. And with its depth, a tight entryway, and a couple of beautiful large rooms, it's garnered interest from names like Sheck Exley, who literally wrote the book on modern cave diving. After the land was donated to the Boy Scouts, Sheck wasted very little time in performing a dive in Deepholder #2 to the maximum depth level in 1980. On the night of May 11th, though, no one would be striving to reach the 360-foot mark. The FSR would instead be conducting several surveying dives in groups of 2 that would enter the cave at staggered times. And first up was Lloyd and his partner. The dive plan was a fairly simple one, as Lloyd and his partner planned to complete a circuit that would take them into an area called the ballroom, and to depths in excess of 200 feet, or 61 meters. For Lloyd, however, this dive would also have a secondary meaning. Not only was it his first dive at the sink, but it was also a chance for him to set a new personal depth record. When the pair were equipped with tanks, they submerged into Dipolder #2 and disappeared into the night. At the base of the bowl-shaped main pool is a restrictive opening that guides divers about 180 feet, or 54 meters, straight down. From there, there's a slight bend that leads to an area called the junction room. After negotiating the extremely narrow entrance and making it to the bend in the tunnel, the two divers were greeted with a bit of an unwelcome sight. As they made their way toward the junction room, visibility inside Deepholder 2 essentially dropped to 0. Just prior to the dive, This part of Florida had experienced some heavy rains, and all that excess water flow into the sinkhole had stirred up the silt inside. They did have a guideline, though, so this wasn't a huge issue. The two then pressed on through the junction room and eventually hit clear water along the upper circuit guideline they were following. At some point, one of the divers experienced a buoyancy problem, which was a minor issue that was quickly addressed before they continued onward. Continuing along the lower circuit guideline now, they made their descent to 200 feet or 76 meters. When they did, Lloyd had officially reached the deepest point of his young cave diving career. But that's when the first signs of real trouble made themselves known. Lloyd's partner watched as Lloyd briefly let go of the lower circuit guideline and descended further and faster than he was supposed to. When he lost the lower circuit guideline as well, he seemed almost confused with the situation, and his partner saw him swing rapidly deeper into the cave. His partner continued after him, though, and soon they both found themselves inside the massive ballroom section, and within its clear waters he was able to regain a handle on the lower circuit guideline. For a moment, it seemed like the panic or confusion or whatever it was had dissipated. Then, believing that Lloyd was now heading toward the exit because, again, this was a circuit, Lloyd's partner started to make his own way out of the cave. Because of the extreme depths the pair had reached, decompression stops were required on the way up. As Lloyd's partner began his decompression stops, though, he couldn't help but notice that he didn't see Lloyd in front of him or behind him. This continued to be the case as the partner performed several more stops. But it wasn't until the 30-foot or 9-meter stop that concern began to set in. While inside the main entrance basin, the partner actually turned back around and started to search for Lloyd, but found no sign of him anywhere. After a few moments of looking around, he surfaced completely, hoping that Lloyd would already be there, but he wasn't. Again, with the silt in the cave, it seemed possible he could have simply passed him without realizing. But without him being there, the alarm was raised. And as several members of the FSR called for help, Lloyd's dive partner and another diver re-entered Dipolder Heinzfolder 2 to resume the search. The pair made it all the way to the still cloudy junction room, but failed to spot Lloyd there. With no luck in finding him, they turned back around and left the cave to wait for diving specialists to arrive and assist. It would be about 17 hours from Lloyd's disappearance inside Dipolder #2 that the first team of recovery divers entered the cave. From there, it took just 25 minutes to find him. Well past the junction room, at a depth of 241 feet or 73 meters, Lloyd's lifeless body was discovered head down on the cave floor, just a handful of feet from the guideline. From the moment his body was discovered, 7 hours would pass before Lloyd's remains emerged through the entrance restriction and onto the banks of the sinkhole. In the aftermath of the tragedy, it was determined that several circumstances led to Lloyd's death, but the main cause was likely CO2 buildup and nitrogen narcosis. This combination of symptoms, and with Lloyd temporarily losing the guideline, proved costly. Even in the best of conditions and circumstances, Losing sight or hold of the guideline can be a terrifying situation for even the most experienced divers. Being relatively new to cave diving as compared to the others, such a scenario in low visibility water likely caused Lloyd to panic. Narcosis can also lead to more intense panic than you'd otherwise feel. This also would have increased his respiration, which then would have put him well on the path to completely blacking out. Recovery divers reported that Lloyd's mask was still in place when his body was found, and he still had his regulator in his mouth. This led them to the conclusion that he blacked out, sank to the bottom, and eventually ran out of air and drowned. 02. Just under a decade later, 29-year-old Guido came all the way from his home in Italy during the spring of 1999 to see Deepholder's massive depth for himself. By that year as well, entering and touring Deepholder #2 came with a list of requirements to be permitted entry. Divers had to be able to prove they had accomplished cave dives in at least 5 other systems and have at least 100 cave dives under their belt. However, Guido's experience fit the bill, and he was eager to make the long trek to Florida. He even planned to write a magazine article about his experience upon returning to Italy. Because along with its depth and challenging environment, Deepholder #2 is known for its waters that are often described as gin clear. And Guido made sure to have his camera in tow so he could take plenty of photographs. The day finally came on April 26th, and Guido arrived at the Sand Hill Boy Scout camp with his travel partner, Simone. The pair would be guided by Sandra, a highly experienced guide who had logged plenty of dives at Deepholder #2. At around 5 p.m. that day, the three stood along the banks of the sinkhole and got some necessary paperwork out of the way first, before suiting up with loads of dive equipment, including several bottles of mixed gas. According to their dive plan for the day, the three would reach depths close to 300 feet. And as seen in the previous story, breathing surface air at such depths can be incredibly dangerous due to nitrogen narcosis. To avoid this, as diving advanced, divers began to use a mixture of gas containing far less nitrogen at depths beyond 100 feet or 30.5 meters. Once everyone was ready to go, the three divers entered the pool and began to descend to the bottom. They then entered the 180-foot narrow vertical drop for a long descent. After carefully navigating that section, they made their way into the junction room before continuing on toward the main event of their dive, the massive ballroom. According to some sources, the room is almost as big as a basketball arena and is notorious among cave divers for its size, beauty, and marine life. Its crystal clear waters only add to this, and to divers it must feel a bit like being in outer space upon entering it for the first time. Guido, likewise, was in awe of the room once the three divers made it there, and they began a slow exploration afterward. They ascended to the ceiling of the chamber and slowly followed it all the way around, with Guido taking photos the entire time until they were back at the entrance to the room. For all intents and purposes, their dive was complete at this point, and they began heading back toward the junction room and the narrow chute that would lead them out of the cave. The journey back, however, would take a bit of time. Just like the previous story, because of the depths they reached and the time they spent there, the three divers would have to perform decompression stops. How many stops and how long they would need to spend at each is determined by a dive computer the divers wear on their wrists that keeps track of how deep they go and how long they spend there. As divers ascend, as with on their way down, their gas will also need to change. So it's not uncommon for them to stash different mixtures at various stops on the way in. It's also not uncommon for divers to have a bottle of pure oxygen on deep dives. This is because pure oxygen can actually reduce decompression time. But, importantly, this can only be used at about 20 feet or about 6 meters from the surface. Unfortunately, this is not what happened on this dive. Among the tanks on Guido's back was a bottle of pure oxygen, but instead of leaving it at the decompression stop upon entering Deep Holder 2, he carried it with him throughout the dive. As the three continued their ascent, they stopped at the 100-foot mark to decompress. And Guido took the regulator from one tank out of his mouth and replaced it with another. Then he took a deep breath and immediately started convulsing uncontrollably. Simone and Sandra then darted toward him to see what the matter was. But there was no helping him. The moment Guido took that one singular breath in, his fate was sealed. He had accidentally breathed from his pure oxygen tank at a place far deeper than where the gas becomes toxic to the body. Oxygen toxicity actually comes in two different forms: pulmonary and central nervous system, CNS. And central nervous system oxygen toxicity is far more sudden and far deadlier. Just like in Guido's case, this form usually sets in the moment higher concentrations of oxygen are breathed in at depths beyond toxicity limits. Immediately upon inhalation, the toxic oxygen impairs the brain and spinal cord and can trigger a seizure. Underwater, this can obviously greatly increase the risk of drowning if the diver's regulator is ejected. And in fact, when Guido began to seize, the regulator from the pure oxygen tank was spat out of his mouth, and his teeth immediately clenched down against each other. This made it impossible for Simone and Sandra to get the correct regulator back into his mouth. In these cases, it's crucial to get the person to the surface as quickly as possible, regardless of the potential threat of severe decompression sickness. That's what Simone and Sandra tried to do, but ascending with Guido's limp body proved to be too much, and they had to leave him inside the cave. When they emerged, they alerted authorities, and recovery divers were eventually able to bring Guido's body to the surface later that night. However, regardless of whether Simone and Sandra were successful in getting Guido out of the cave or not, it's likely it was already too late for him. The moment he took that deep breath, his central nervous system basically shut down, according to dive experts familiar with the incident. The 29-year-old's death could have been avoided if he had simply stashed his pure oxygen tank at the proper depth on the way in. Located just north of the town of Mayo, Florida, Peacock Springs is more remote than some of Florida's other state parks for cave divers. But it's a picturesque place with tall trees surrounding 5 different springs in the park. Throughout the state, Florida is home to around 700 springs, which are characterized by their water flow and connection to the Floridan aquifer system. And among the 5 diveable sites at Peacock Springs, which include more than 10 miles of mapped cave tunnels, the system known as Peacock Springs Third is considered the most challenging. That's what made what happened there on April 9th, 1990, all the more horrifying. 2 adults and a child suited up on the banks of P3 as they readied themselves for the dive. Since none of the 3 were named in the source material, they've been given pseudonyms to avoid any confusion. At 53 years old, Jim was visiting from the Atlanta area with his 10-year-old son, Matthew. And while the reason for their visit to Florida was never reported, the 2 apparently had a bond over diving. 2 years earlier, Jim had gone through a cavern diving course and earned a certification, although he was not cave diving certified, which are apparently distinct from one another. His son, meanwhile, was far too young to even be considered for open water certification at the time. The 3rd man, Paul, was a classmate of Jim's in the cavern diving course he took. And just like Jim, Paul wasn't cave diving certified either. In short, none of them would have been recommended to dive a place as challenging as P3 anytime soon. When all 3 were ready to go, they entered the spring and descended. Paul led the way toward the entrance to P3, which sits at a depth of around 25 feet below the surface. Once they got there, Paul pulled out a spool of rope and affixed it to just outside the entryway to serve as a guideline for the 3 divers. At the very least, this was a great idea, considering their inexperience. When this was complete, they passed into the cave entrance, and right away, a silt-out occurred. Suddenly, none of the divers could see far enough in the water to get a look at one another. And Paul made a terrible assumption. Thinking that all of them were now headed back out of the cave, Paul pulled the guideline he had tied just outside the entrance to the cave and began his ascent. Once he reached clear water, however, Paul spotted Matthew on his way up to the surface, but it was immediately apparent that Jim was missing. Back inside the cave, Jim was in serious trouble. He was lost in the silt-out and couldn't tell which direction he needed to go to get out of the cave without a guideline to help him. For some untold amount of time, Jim likely tried to feel his way around the walls for a way out, stirring up more silt and making his situation worse, until his air tanks ran out and he drowned. His son, meanwhile, was just dozens of feet above him, waiting for him to resurface. When rescuers were alerted and arrived at P3, they quickly geared up and entered the spring, only to find that the area near the cave entrance was so silted out that they couldn't safely perform a search for Jim. His body was eventually recovered once enough time had passed to allow the silt to resettle inside the cave entrance, and Jim was found just feet away from safety. After the tragedy of Jim's passing, the inexperience of all 3 divers was blamed for his death. And although both Jim and Paul were cavern certified, neither received the extensive training that goes into becoming cave diving certified. In the aftermath as well, it wasn't clear to investigators what exactly caused the extreme silt-out the 3 divers experienced upon entering P3, although some type of contact with the walls is likely. Those who have been inside P3 attest that the cave is coated in a thick layer of very light sediment. It's been theorized that the silt-out that claimed Jim's life might have occurred as a result of the compression that takes place with a diver's exposure suit upon descent from the surface. There are several different types of exposure suits, and you may be familiar with terms like wetsuit, dry suit, or skin suit. Many suits are compression resistant, but the ones the three divers were wearing in 1990 weren't. What happens is that air from the surface gets trapped between the skin and the suit. And as a diver descends, this air will compress and the suit will become tighter. When this happens, a diver who's not used to this change could experience an issue with buoyancy, which may cause them to adjust by flailing their arms and legs to regain control. It's possible that Jim brushed up against the walls as he fought to correct the issue, causing the extreme silt-out that led to his death. Jim's death was the fifth involving a certified cave or cavern diver in Florida in the previous 2 years. And it's estimated that the entire Peacock Spring cave system has claimed the lives of at least 45 cave divers. Another of the springs in Peacock Springs State Park is one known as the Olson Sink. The Olson Sink system is made up of 2 separate tunnels, the upstream tunnel and the downstream tunnel. And both of them meet up with other systems within the park. It's been years since the entrance directly into Olson Sink was allowed by the park due to erosion. So, divers today wanting to visit that part of the system have to enter one of the other springs and navigate the underwater tunnels to get there. In 1990, however, entry directly into Olson Sink was still permitted. And on November 4th that year, just months after the previous fatal dive, Darden Davis squeezed into one of the 2 narrow openings for a solo dive. Darden was no stranger to diving alone, and he was known to be a certified and seasoned cave diver. Gearing up with double 104 cubic foot tanks, and one tank he'd stage at some point during the dive for later use, Darden was planning to travel the upstream tunnel that day. This was a dive he had performed many times in the past, both with buddy divers and by himself. So it was a devastating shock to the dive community when he was found dead just 150 feet or 45 meters into Olson Sink. Schools of thought on solo cave diving can vary depending on who you ask. Some find it to be a perfectly safe practice, so long as you dive within your limits. Others think it's an unnecessary danger to add to an already inherently dangerous activity. But in any case, when tragedies occur during solo dives, details are generally limited due to there not being any survivors to tell the tale of what happened. In Darden's case, however, there was much that could be inferred about his final dive based on the state of his equipment. Arguably just as important as an autopsy on the body is a forensic examination of the gear. And there were several curious things experts found among Darden's equipment. Interestingly, while his double tanks were still found to contain about 1,200 psi of breathable air in them, his stage tank was completely empty. In checking over the rest of his equipment, his valve regulator, which governs the flow of air from the tank to a diver's mouthpiece, was found to be in the off position. A check of his secondary regulator revealed that it was in a state of free flow. And lastly, one of the tubes on his stage tank was malfunctioning. With this being the only information available, diving experts pieced together the puzzle of what most likely happened to Darden on the dive. Here's what they believe went wrong. Shortly after Darden's dive began, he likely experienced an issue with a free-flowing regulator. A free flow means the regulator was stuck in an open position, allowing the air from his tanks to rush out uncontrollably. The cause of the free flow wasn't determined, but in general, free flow can occur due to a variety of reasons, from degraded or malfunctioning equipment to cold water freezing the valves. To stop the air leak and conserve his gas, Darden might have turned it off manually. At this point, he likely turned around to abort the dive and could have been a bit panicked by the loss of air from his tanks. Then, while trying to swim out, one of two things might have occurred. First, he could have accidentally knocked the valve from his backup regulator, closing it. Or, second, he may never have opened it all the way in the first place. If the valve was partly open, as the tank pressure dropped, the regulator wouldn't get enough air to function properly anymore. As a result of these valve issues, with one regulator shut off and the other not delivering air smoothly, Darden was probably struggling to breathe. And if you can imagine, again, he was probably already on edge as he tried to stay calm and make his way toward the exit. As the problems compounded, the panic must have been impossible to ignore. In the stress of the situation, he might have also forgotten that he turned off the first one. So, when he looked at his pressure gauges, they read 0. This could have made him think that both his tanks were empty, when in reality he just wasn't getting air because the valve was shut off or restricted. So, with his double tanks reaching a point of failure in his mind, he seems to have grabbed for his 80 cubic foot stage bottle. This was his last-ditch effort to get air. The stage bottle had a single regulator with 2 hoses attached. When the gear was inspected after his body was recovered, it was found that one of those hoses wasn't working properly. It could have been leaking, or just hard to breathe from, but the exact issue was unclear. So, as Darden tried to desperately escape from Olsen's sink, air might have been escaping from the unused hose, wasting what little gas he had left. In the simplest terms, Darden's main tanks still had air in them, but because of the equipment malfunctions and some valves being closed, he couldn't access that air. In checking his gauges, he thought he was out of gas, so he switched to his smaller backup tank, and then lost more air due to another malfunction there. In essence, his death seemed to have resulted from a tragic chain reaction of equipment issues, likely compounded by confusion, stress, and likely panic. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you soon.